Hello, coders. And I do mean coders. There's really two kinds of coders that I want to talk to tonight. One is the obvious set of software coders, the tool makers in the audience and those of you that are online. Your enterprise architects, your devs, your engineers. But there's another set of coders that we need to bring into this conversation, this global conversation. They're rule makers, they're legislators, they're policy makers, and they're regulators. We need to bring these two sets of codes together. One set of coders does performance testing against machines and networks. They measure throughput, they measure fault tolerance and security. The other set of coders measures human behavior. Their compliance of people and institutions is expressed in multi-party contracts that cross jurisdictions and that meet regulatory requirements. The thing that both sets of coders have in common, as well as all the global stakeholders, is this notion of trust. We hear that word again and again, particularly in this new world that we live in. So let's define it. Not so much like trust grandma, but we have to have systems that are reliable, systems that are repeatable, and systems that are secure. We do that because what we want to have be part of both sets of codes is trusted transactions, whether that's voting or consensus, etc. We want to transact at high volumes, high velocities, in a wide variety of circumstances. If we get this right, where the tool makers, the software coders, and the rule makers, the regulators, can align these code bases, great things happen. The world really changes. Think about MasterCard a couple of decades ago, where originally a localized bank, a localized sets of merchants created this new card system. But it was through the extensibility and scalability of the regulatory environment changing, as well as the technology changing, that we now have a trust framework in everyone's pocket. All the stakeholders understand the terms of trust in these new MasterCard and Visa networks. We don't have to look very far to see what happens when we can align rule makers and tool makers in the New York Stock Exchange. What a fantastic explosion of both wealth creation, technology, and regulation. We have trusted transactions within the New York Stock Exchange, or the FTSE, or the Hang Seng, that create enormous new wealth. It is because we've been able on a global basis to reconcile these two sets of codes that new things, new opportunities, new wealth is created. In the world of standards, in the OpenID Foundation, we have the OpenID Connect, which becomes the standard for how identity is managed on the internet. If we get alignment, we get more trust. Innovation is accelerated, both in the legal world and in the technology world. Markets expand, and governance is trusted. But all's not well in the world. That comes as no surprise to the world in general, and in this strange phenomenon that we're seeing every day in the mass market. We've got three known unknowns. We've got the first factor, which is markets correct. So as mass media begins to tell grandma about Bitcoin, and grandma begins to risk her savings on these new kinds of instruments, that mass market coverage drives public sentiment. And when public sentiment is driven, political intervention is only a matter of time. It's no surprise to anybody in this room that the SEC is struggling with how to regulate this new phenomenon, and that other legislators in Colorado and Arizona are doing their best to help blockchain industries grow in their states. That's not only happening in the US, but it's happening on a global basis. So when governments intervene, we have to be mindful of this kind of conversation that occurs between the public and private sector. On February 14th, I was on the Hill at the House Science and Technology Committee, and the Congress people were asking the experts, well, what should the role of the government be in this blockchain and distributed ledger world? And someone said, well, let's have a national commission on blockchain. Now that may be a good idea. It may be a not so good idea. The question is the industry ready for that conversation between the public and the private sector? To what extent can the industry lead that conversation? And what happens if it's an ill-informed enterprise? What happens is lawyers litigate. So let's move beyond that and see if we can't create something new. A foundation that crosses all the different permutations and solution sets in this wonderful industry, this very disruptive technology. Let's see if we can't align the tools and the rules so we can expand the pie in the marketplace for everyone. Let's build on what's built, not just Hashgraph, but the great work that's been done in other Ethereum Foundation, the Sovereign Foundation. Let's pull them all together so that we can improve what we mean by governance, so we can define it in terms of standards, in terms of voting, in terms of how consensus is reached in governance, much in the same way that it is built into software. If we get it right, if we understand governance and define it in a new way, we can inform governments. So let's take this approach. If we want to do this new foundation, for sure it has to be nonprofit. It must be global, because the internet is not a single jurisdiction phenomenon. And it has to move across industries. Most importantly, this approach has to be inclusive, and it has to be technology agnostic. So we're proposing something new tonight to map onto the concerns that you heard earlier about governance of these systems to the relationship of governance to governments. And we're going to introduce you to what we're calling the Distributed Ledger Foundation. It's a new foundation that has two jobs. It is to secure the work that is being done right now, to help better align these two code bases so that we can build on what's built. The other thing that it will do is to begin to inform governments as a private sector-led conversation about what regulation should look like, not only on K Street, but also in Beijing, also in Singapore and in London. So we could talk a lot about what the foundation aspires to be, but here's what we're going to do first. We're going to go to the best place on the planet for governance. The Stanford School of Law and Informatics has been researching blockchain governance for the last 6 years. The professors and student bodies in that law school has been looking at this phenomenon and trying to understand how law and the governance of the future will develop over time. So on the 9th of May, we're going to pull the best and the brightest into a conversation and talk about standards for smart contracts, aligning the financial interests of stakeholders in these new business models and consortiums, and yes, how voting works in these new systems. We think if we can get it right in Stanford, we're going to be able to take that show on the road, because we have to. My friend Helen is going to tell you about how we're going to move from Stanford to London, from London and beyond. Come on, Helen, we'll talk some more about it right now.